The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Thomas Wright was in the middle of a meeting when his cell phone buzzed in his pocket. He usually ignored calls during work hours, but something told him to check this one. The area code wasn't familiar, somewhere down south. He excused himself from the conference room and stepped into the hallway. "Hello, is this Thomas Wright?" The voice on the other end belonged to an older woman with a gentle southern accent. "Yes, that's me," Thomas replied, leaning against the wall. "My name is Dorothy Wilson. I'm a lawyer representing the estate of Harold Wright. I believe he was your grandfather." Thomas felt a small jolt of surprise. His grandfather wasn't someone he thought about often. They'd met maybe 3 or 4 times when Thomas was a child. Brief visits during summer breaks. His father and grandfather had some kind of falling out years ago, and the family had mostly lost touch. "Yes, that's right," Thomas said. "Is everything okay?" There was a pause on the line. "Mr. Wright, I'm calling because your grandfather passed away last month." "I'm very sorry for your loss." Thomas closed his eyes. He felt a complicated mix of emotions: sadness for a man he barely knew, regret for the relationship they never had. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I hadn't heard." "There's something else," Dorothy continued. "Your grandfather left you something in his will. Something quite significant, actually." Thomas hadn't expected that. He'd never thought about inheritances or family legacies. At 42, he'd built his own life as a software engineer in Chicago, far from his southern roots. "He left you land, Mr. Wright. A lot of land." Thomas listened in growing disbelief as Dorothy explained that his grandfather had owned over 1,500 acres of prime rural property, about 30 miles outside of Atlanta, land that had been in the Wright family for generations. "Wait," Thomas interrupted. 1,500 acres? That's massive. And he left it all to me? There must be some mistake." "No mistake," Dorothy assured him. "Your grandfather was very clear in his will. The property was purchased by your great-grandfather back in 1923. It's been passed down and now it belongs to you." Thomas's mind raced. His great-grandfather had bought that much land in Georgia in the 1920s. As a black man in the Jim Crow South? It seemed impossible. "How did my great-grandfather get that much land back then?" Thomas asked. "That's quite a story," Dorothy said, her voice warming. "From what I understand, your great-grandfather worked for a wealthy white family who thought highly of him. When the family fell on hard times during the Depression, they sold him a large portion of their property for a fraction of its worth. They kept it quiet, of course. It wasn't the kind of transaction people approved of back then." Thomas felt a surge of pride. His great-grandfather had managed something remarkable in an era when black land ownership was actively discouraged and often dangerous. "The land has only grown more valuable," Dorothy continued. "The county has developed significantly in recent years. Property values have skyrocketed." Thomas sat down on a bench in the hallway, his legs suddenly weak. "How much are we talking about?" "Conservative estimates put the value at around $12 million, maybe more." The world seemed to tilt slightly. Thomas had done well for himself professionally, but nothing on this scale. "12 million, he repeated, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "You'll need to come down to Georgia to sign some paperwork," Dorothy said. "And you might want to see the property for yourself." 2 weeks later, Thomas found himself driving a rental car down a 2-lane highway in rural Georgia. The late April air was warm and heavy with the scent of pine and new growth. He followed the GPS until it directed him onto a smaller road, then an even smaller one. Eventually, he turned onto a dirt path that cut through dense woods. After about a mile, the trees opened up to reveal rolling hills covered in tall grass that swayed in the breeze. Thomas stopped the car and got out, standing in awe at the vastness before him. He could see for miles. Fields, woods, a small lake glittering in the distance. And it was all his. He took a deep breath, feeling a connection to this place that surprised him. His ancestors had walked this land, had fought to keep it in the family through hard times and open hostility. It felt like discovering a piece of himself he never knew was missing. Thomas spent the day exploring, driving the perimeter of the property as best he could. He found old farm buildings abandoned but still standing, a small family cemetery where his great-grandparents and other relatives were buried. It was overwhelming, the weight of this history he'd known nothing about. As the sun began to set, Thomas decided to see more of the surrounding area. According to Dorothy, There had been significant development nearby in recent years. He headed toward the northern boundary of the property, where it apparently bordered a newer community. That's when he saw it, an elaborate stone entrance with Oak Ridge Estates carved into it. Behind the entrance was a neighborhood of large, expensive-looking homes with perfectly manicured lawns. Thomas slowed down, confused. The map Dorothy had given him showed that his property extended well past this point. He parked his car and walked toward the entrance, where a sign advertised, "Luxury Living in Exclusive Gated Community." A security guard in a small booth waved him down. "Can I help you, sir?" the guard asked, eyeing Thomas with suspicion. "Just looking around," Thomas replied casually. "This seems like a nice neighborhood." "It's the finest in the county," the guard said proudly. 75 custom homes, championship golf course, private lake access. Thomas nodded, his mind racing. "How long has it been here?" "About 10 years now. Changed the whole area. Property values through the roof." Thomas thanked the guard and walked back to his car. Something wasn't adding up. According to Dorothy and the property maps, at least part of this development was sitting on land that should belong to him. That evening in his hotel room, Thomas called Dorothy. "There's a subdivision called Oak Ridge Estates on what looks like part of my grandfather's property," he explained. "How is that possible?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "That's interesting," Dorothy finally said. But something in her tone told Thomas she wasn't entirely surprised. "Let me look into this. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning?" The next day, Thomas sat across from Dorothy in her small law office as she pulled up county records on her computer. "This is very strange," she said, her brow furrowed. "According to these records, about 200 acres of your grandfather's land was sold to Oak Ridge Development Company in Ithring, but I've reviewed all your grandfather's papers and there's absolutely no record of this sale on his end. Could he have sold it and not kept records?" Thomas asked. Dorothy shook her head firmly. "Your grandfather was meticulous about his paperwork. Besides, a sale that size, we're talking millions of dollars, would have left a paper trail. Bank deposits, tax records, something." She turned the screen toward Thomas. "Look at this deed of sale. The signature doesn't even match your grandfather's." Thomas leaned forward, studying the document. The signature was similar to the one he'd seen on his grandfather's will, but clearly different in key ways. "Are you saying someone forged my grandfather's signature and stole 200 acres of his land?" Thomas asked, anger beginning to rise in his chest. "I'm saying we need to investigate further," Dorothy replied carefully. "Let me make some calls." Over the next few days, the picture became clearer and darker. The Oak Ridge Homeowners Association, working with a local developer, had somehow pushed through a land purchase using documents that claimed the property was abandoned. They'd built an entire luxury community on land they never legally owned. As Thomas stood at the edge of his property, looking at the mansions of Oak Ridge Estates in the distance, he made a decision. He would not be another black landowner cheated out of his birthright. Whatever it took, he would reclaim what belonged to his family, what had been protected and preserved through generations, against all odds. He pulled out his phone and called Dorothy. "Find me the best real estate attorney in the state," he said. "Someone who isn't afraid to take on powerful people." The battle for his 1,500 acres, all of them, had just begun. The law office of Patricia Chen was on the top floor of a sleek downtown Atlanta building. Thomas sat in the reception area, nervously flipping through a magazine without really seeing the pages. After 3 days of phone calls and research, Dorothy had secured him an appointment with one of Georgia's most respected real estate attorneys. A door opened, and a woman in her 50s with short black hair and sharp eyes walked out. "Mr. Wright, I'm Patricia Chen. Please come in." Thomas followed her into a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Maps and documents were already spread across her conference table. "Dorothy filled me in on the basics," Patricia said, gesturing for Thomas to take a seat. "But I'd like to hear everything from the beginning." For the next hour, Thomas explained how he'd discovered his inheritance and the troubling revelation about Oak Ridge Estates. Patricia listened intently, occasionally jotting notes or asking clarifying questions. "What I don't understand," Thomas said, "is how they got away with this. Didn't anyone check if they actually owned the land?" Patricia sighed. "That's where things get complicated. I've been looking into Oak Ridge Development Company. They're well connected locally. The CEO, William Barnett, sits on several boards with county officials. His partner, Robert Taylor, is the president of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. She pulled out a document and slid it across the table. This is the deed they filed. They claimed the land was abandoned property with taxes unpaid for years. But look here. She pointed to a property identification number. This doesn't match any legitimate county record for your grandfather's land. They essentially created a fake paper trail. That's straight-up fraud, Thomas said, anger rising in his voice. Yes, it is, Patricia agreed. And I suspect several county officials were either negligent or complicit. So what do we do? Patricia leaned forward. We fight. We file a lawsuit immediately to establish your rightful ownership. We request all records related to the land sale and development permits, and we get a formal survey of the entire 1,500 acres to definitively prove the boundaries. Thomas nodded, determination replacing his anger. Let's do it. Over the next few weeks, Thomas took leave from his job in Chicago and temporarily relocated to Georgia. He rented a small house near his property and immersed himself in the case. Patricia assembled a team that included a historical property researcher, a forensic accountant, and a surveyor with expertise in disputed boundaries. The survey confirmed what they suspected. Approximately 220 acres of Thomas's land had been incorporated into Oak Ridge Estates, including parts of their golf course and about 40 of their most expensive homes. With the evidence mounting, Patricia filed a comprehensive lawsuit against Oak Ridge Development Company, the Homeowners Association, and several county officials. The local news picked up the story, framing it as a David versus Goliath battle. Thomas soon discovered how powerful his opponents truly were. The day after the lawsuit was filed, he received a phone call from Robert Taylor, the HOA president. Mr. Wright, Taylor's voice was smooth as silk. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Perhaps we could meet and discuss this like gentlemen. Thomas glanced at Patricia, who was sitting across from him. She nodded her approval. Fine, Thomas replied. Tomorrow 2 p.m. at my attorney's office. I was thinking somewhere more casual. Perhaps the country club, my attorney's office, or not at all, Thomas said firmly. There was a pause. Very well. Tomorrow at 2. The next day, Robert Taylor arrived with William Barnett and their attorney, a slick man in an expensive suit named George Henderson. Taylor was in his 60s, silver-haired and tanned with the easy confidence of someone used to getting his way. Barnett was younger, with a politician's smile that never reached his eyes. Thank you for meeting with us, Taylor began once everyone was seated. I believe we can resolve this situation without lengthy court proceedings. We're listening, Patricia said coolly. Taylor leaned forward. We understand your client has inherited a significant property. We're willing to offer $500,000 for a quitclaim deed on the disputed acres, allowing both parties to move forward. Thomas almost laughed out loud. $500,000 for 220 acres of prime developed land? Land you never legally purchased in the first place? Mr. Wright, Henderson interjected. The development has significantly increased the value of that previously unused land. Our offer is quite generous considering the circumstances. What circumstances? Thomas asked. The circumstance where you forged documents and stole my family's land? Barnett's smile faltered. Those are serious accusations. The paperwork we filed was in order. If there were irregularities, they weren't on our end. We have evidence that the property ID numbers were falsified, Patricia countered, and that your company rushed the permits through with minimal oversight. Evidence can be interpreted in many ways, Henderson said dismissively. Courts favor established property owners. The homes at Oak Ridge have been there for nearly a decade. The residents are innocent parties in this dispute. Then they should be angry at you, Thomas said, for selling them homes on stolen land. Taylor's pleasant facade cracked slightly. Let me be clear, Mr. Wright. You're taking on some very influential people. This could drag on for years. Legal fees will mount. Your reputation will be questioned. Is that really how you want to spend your time and resources? Thomas felt a chill at the implied threat but held Taylor's gaze. My great-grandfather bought that land when black people weren't supposed to own property. My grandfather protected it during times when land theft from black owners was common practice. I'm not about to let it go now because you find it inconvenient. The meeting ended shortly after with no resolution. As they left, Barnett turned back to Thomas. We tried to be reasonable. Remember that. True to their word, the Oak Ridge team fought back hard. They filed motions to dismiss the case. They claimed Thomas lacked standing, that the statute of limitations had expired, that the development had been done in good faith. When those tactics failed, they shifted to a public relations campaign. Local newspapers ran stories questioning Thomas's motives. "Chicago man claims historic development in land grab," read one headline. Community meetings were held where residents worried about their property values and shared concerns about an outsider threatening their homes. Thomas wasn't entirely without support. Some local residents, particularly older black families who had their own stories of land disputes, reached out with encouragement. A few homeowners from Oak Ridge Estates itself contacted him discreetly, concerned they'd purchased homes with questionable titles. 3 months into the legal battle, Thomas was reviewing documents in Patricia's office when her assistant rushed in. "You need to see this," she said, turning on the television mounted on the wall. The local news was broadcasting from the steps of the county courthouse. Robert Taylor stood at a podium flanked by about 20 Oak Ridge residents. "This frivolous lawsuit threatens the homes of hardworking families," Taylor was saying. "Mr. Wright has no connection to this community. He's never lived here, never contributed here. Now he wants to profit off technicalities and paperwork, errors." The camera panned to show distressed-looking homeowners holding signs that read, "Save our homes and don't punish innocent families." Thomas watched in disbelief as Taylor continued. "We've discovered that the land Mr. Wright claims was stolen was actually abandoned for years. His grandfather neglected it, failed to maintain it. We transformed worthless scrubland into a thriving community." "That's a blatant lie," Thomas said, his hands clenching into fists. "My grandfather visited that land every week. He paid taxes on every acre every year." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "They're getting desperate. This means we're winning." The next day, Thomas received an unexpected visitor at his rental house. A woman in her 70s knocked on his door, introducing herself as Louise Watkins. "I worked for your grandfather for nearly 30 years, she explained as Thomas invited her in. "I kept his books, helped manage the property." Thomas sat down with her at his kitchen table. "I wish I'd known him better," he said quietly. Louise smiled. "He was a good man, private but kind. He talked about you, you know. Kept photos of you growing up." This surprised Thomas. "He did?" She nodded. "He respected your father's decision to move north, to give you different opportunities. But he always hoped you'd come back someday, learn about your roots here." Thomas felt a pang of regret for the relationship he'd never had with his grandfather. "I'm trying to protect what he built," he said. "That's why I'm here," Louise replied. She reached into her large purse and pulled out a weathered leather-bound book. "Your grandfather kept meticulous records. This is his property journal. Every visit, every improvement, every penny spent on taxes, all documented for the past 40 years. Thomas carefully opened the book, finding page after page of handwritten entries, receipts, and occasional photographs. It was a detailed chronicle that thoroughly disproved Taylor's claims of abandonment. "This is exactly what we need," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Louise patted his hand. "He would be proud of you, fighting for what's right. Not everyone around here has the courage to stand up to people like Taylor and Barnett." As she got up to leave, she turned back to Thomas. "There's something else you should know. 10 years ago, when the development started, your grandfather fought it too. But he was already in his 80s and suddenly dealing with health problems. I always thought the timing was suspicious." Thomas felt a cold anger settle in his chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your grandfather didn't just give up. I think they found ways to pressure him to wait him out." She sighed. "Just be careful, Thomas. These people play by different rules." After Louise left, Thomas called Patricia. "We have new evidence," he said. "And I think it's time we went on the offensive." The county courthouse was packed. Every seat was filled with people standing along the walls. The case of Wright versus Oak Ridge Estates had become the talk of the town, drawing curious locals, concerned homeowners, and even a few reporters from Atlanta news stations. Thomas sat beside Patricia at the plaintiff's table, trying to appear calm despite the butterflies in his stomach. Across the aisle, Robert Taylor and William Barnett whispered to their attorney. They looked confident, as if they couldn't imagine a world where they wouldn't get their way. "All rise," called the bailiff as Judge Eleanor Hargrove entered the courtroom. At 68, Judge Hargrove had a reputation for fairness and an impressive memory for legal details. She was also known for her no-nonsense approach to courtroom theatrics. "Be seated," she said, adjusting her glasses as she looked over the papers before her. "I've reviewed the motions and countermotions in this case. Frankly, I'm disappointed this matter has dragged on for 6 months without resolution." She looked up, her gaze moving between the two tables. "Today we'll hear arguments regarding the plaintiff's request for a preliminary injunction and the defendant's motion for dismissal." Patricia rose. "Your Honor, we have new evidence we'd like to submit to the court." Judge Hargrove nodded. "Proceed." For the next hour, Patricia methodically presented their case. She entered into evidence the property journal from Thomas's grandfather, along with tax records going back 40 years. She called a handwriting expert who testified that the signature on the deed of sale was almost certainly forged. She presented the findings from their survey, clearly showing the encroachment onto Wright family land. Finally, she called Louise Watkins to the stand. "Ms. Watkins, how long did you work for Harold Wright?" Patricia asked. 32 years, Louise replied, until his health began failing in 2014. "And during that time, did Mr. Wright ever mention selling a portion of his land to Oak Ridge Development Company?" "Never," Louise said firmly. "In fact, when the construction started, he was furious. He hired a lawyer, but then he had his first stroke. After that, he couldn't fight the way he wanted to. To your knowledge, did Harold Wright ever abandon or neglect his property?" Louise almost laughed. "Not a chance. That land was his pride and joy. He visited at least weekly, maintained the roads, managed the timber, kept the boundaries clear. He even ran off poachers and trespassers when needed." During cross-examination, George Henderson tried to undermine Louise's testimony. "Isn't it possible Mr. Wright simply didn't tell you about the sale?" he asked. "After all, he wasn't obligated to share his business dealings with an employee." Louise fixed him with a stern look. "Mr. Wright and I spoke every day for 3 decades. We discussed every decision about that property. More importantly, I handled his accounts. A multi-million-dollar transaction would have shown up in his finances, which I managed." When Louise stepped down, Henderson called his own witness, Frank Powell, a former county clerk who had processed the original deed transfer. The paperwork appeared to be in order. Powell testified. "The property ID matched county records at the time." "And did you personally verify the property boundaries?" Patricia asked during cross-examination. Powell shifted uncomfortably. "That's not typically part of the clerk's role." "Did you verify the signature against previous documents signed by Harold Wright?" "I assumed the notary had done that. And who was the notary on this document?" Powell looked down at his hands. "Diane Barnett." "Any relation to William Barnett of Oak Ridge Development Company?" "His sister-in-law," Powell admitted. By lunchtime, the momentum had clearly shifted. Judge Hargrove called both attorneys to the bench. "I've seen enough," she said quietly. "This case has serious merit, and I'm troubled by what appears to be deliberate fraud. I strongly suggest the defendants consider settlement discussions." During the lunch break, Henderson approached Patricia with a new offer, $2 million for the disputed land, plus legal fees. Patricia relayed this to Thomas as they sat in a small conference room, picking at sandwiches. "That's still nowhere near the actual value," Thomas pointed out. "No, it's not," Patricia agreed. "But it's an acknowledgement that they know they're in trouble." Thomas shook his head. "This isn't just about money. It's about right and wrong. It's about my family's legacy. I want the land back, all of it." When court resumed, Henderson requested time for further settlement discussions. Judge Hargrove granted a 1-week continuance but also issued her ruling on the preliminary matters. "Based on the evidence presented, I'm denying the motion to dismiss," she announced. "Furthermore, I'm granting a temporary injunction preventing any further development on the disputed property. Finally, I'm ordering a full forensic audit of all documents related to this case." As they left the courthouse, reporters surrounded them on the steps. "Mr. Wright, what's your response to the ruling?" asked a woman with a microphone. Thomas hadn't prepared for media attention but spoke from the heart. "I'm grateful that the truth is coming to light. This case was never about disrupting a community. It's about honoring my family's history and standing up against a wrong that goes beyond just me." That evening, Thomas was surprised by a knock at his door. He opened it to find a middle-aged couple standing nervously on his porch. "Mr. Wright, I'm David Thompson, and this is my wife Lisa. We live in Oak Ridge Estates." Thomas tensed, unsure what to expect, but invited them in. "We've been following your case," Lisa said once they were seated in the living room. "A lot of homeowners are worried, but we wanted you to know that some of us understand you're not the villain here." David nodded. "We bought our home in good faith, but after hearing what happened, we're angry too. At the developers, not at you." "We're not the only ones who feel this way," Lisa added. "There's a growing group of us who want to find a fair solution." This was the first time anyone from Oak Ridge had approached Thomas with anything other than hostility. "I appreciate that more than you know," he said sincerely. "Would you be willing to meet with our group?" David asked. "Away from the HOA board and the lawyers? Just neighbors talking to neighbors?" Thomas considered this. "Yes," he finally said. "I'd like that." 2 days later, Thomas met with 11 Oak Ridge homeowners at David and Lisa's house. They shared stories of how they'd saved for their dream homes, only to discover they might be built on stolen land. Many expressed frustration with the HOA board for keeping them in the dark about the legal issues. "Taylor and Barnett assured us everything was fine," explained an older man named Joe. "They said you were just trying to extort money, that there was no real case. We've invested everything in these homes," said another homeowner, a woman named Rachel, "but we don't want to benefit from something wrong." As Thomas listened, an idea began to form. "What if there was a way for you to keep your homes legally and ethically?" he asked. The next morning, Thomas called Patricia. "I want to make a counteroffer," he said, "but it's unconventional." After hearing his plan, Patricia was quiet for a moment. "It's unusual," she admitted, "but it might work. Let me draw up the papers." 3 days later, they presented the offer to Henderson, Taylor, and Barnett. Thomas would sell the disputed land directly to the current homeowners, not to the development company or the HOA, at a fair market price for undeveloped land, significantly less than developed property rates. The homeowners get clear title to their land. They can stay in their homes without fear, Patricia explained. "And my client receives fair compensation for property that was taken from his family." Henderson looked intrigued, but Taylor was furious. "You can't do this. The HOA has exclusive rights to negotiate for the community." "Actually, they don't," Patricia countered. "We've reviewed the HOA bylaws. They have no authority to prevent individual homeowners from purchasing the land under their own homes." Barnett leaned forward. "What about the golf course and common areas?" "Those would be handled separately," Thomas said. "But the same principle applies. Fair market value for undeveloped land." "This is outrageous," Taylor sputtered. "We won't allow it." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "It's not up to you. The homeowners I've spoken with are very interested in this solution." When news of the offer spread through Oak Ridge Estates, the community response was immediate. Most homeowners saw it as a reasonable compromise, a way to secure their investments while acknowledging the wrong that had been done. A group of 40 homeowners signed a petition supporting the plan. The HOA board called an emergency meeting, trying to maintain control of the situation. But as Taylor railed against Thomas and the betrayal by residents, something unexpected happened. Joe stood up from the audience. "Mr. Taylor, how long have you known our homes were built on land with disputed ownership?" The room went quiet. "That's not relevant," Taylor said dismissively. "It's absolutely relevant," Rachel joined in. "You had a duty to disclose any issues that could affect our property values." Other homeowners began to speak up, demanding answers about what the board had known and when. The unified front that Taylor and Barnett had counted on was crumbling. The next day, as Thomas and Patricia were preparing for the rescheduled court date, Thomas received a call from Judge Hargrove's clerk. "The defendants have requested an emergency settlement conference," she informed him. "The judge has granted the request. All parties are to appear tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Thomas looked at Patricia. "What do you think this means?" She smiled for the first time in days. "I think it means we're winning." The settlement conference room felt too small for the tension it contained. Thomas sat with Patricia on one side of the long table. Across from them, Taylor and Barnett looked like men who hadn't slept well, their usual polished appearance slightly frayed at the edges. Henderson sat between them, shuffling papers with forced calm. Judge Hargrove entered and took her seat at the head of the table. "Good morning," she said, looking around at the assembled parties. "I understand there's interest in resolving this matter without further litigation." Henderson cleared his throat. Yes, Your Honor, recent developments have made settlement a more attractive option for my clients. Thomas suspected those developments included the growing revolt among Oak Ridge homeowners and the forensic audit that would likely uncover even more damning evidence. Excellent, Judge Hargrove said. I'll hear proposals from both sides. Patricia outlined Thomas's offer again. Individual sales to homeowners at fair market value for undeveloped land, with similar terms for common areas. When she finished, Henderson leaned forward. My clients are prepared to accept a modified version of this proposal. They request that the Homeowners Association handle the purchase of common areas as a single transaction. Individual homeowners would be free to purchase their lots directly. As suggested, Judge Hargrove looked at Patricia. Is this acceptable to your client? Patricia turned to Thomas, who nodded. Yes, with one condition. Full transparency about how this situation occurred. I want all records related to the original land acquisition made public. Taylor started to object, but Henderson placed a restraining hand on his arm. We can provide those records with the understanding that any potential legal consequences are addressed within this settlement. Thomas frowned. You want immunity? We want closure, Henderson countered. For everyone involved, Judge Hargrove interjected. Let's be clear. This settlement would resolve the civil claims only. If criminal fraud occurred, that's beyond my authority to dismiss. The negotiations continued for hours, working through details of payment structures, timelines, and legal responsibilities. By late afternoon, they had a framework agreement. One last thing, Thomas said as they prepared to conclude. I want a public apology. Not just to me, but to my grandfather and the homeowners who were kept in the dark. Taylor's face reddened. Absolutely not. We've compromised enough. Barnett, who had been mostly quiet throughout the proceedings, finally spoke up. Robert, enough. We're going to do this. Taylor looked at his partner in disbelief. Bill, you can't be serious. I am, Barnett said firmly. It's over. We lost. Let's salvage what we can and move on. The final agreement was signed the next day. The terms were straightforward. Thomas would regain clear title to all 1,500 acres. He would then sell individual lots to homeowners at $25,000 per acre, roughly the value of undeveloped land in the area. The HOA would purchase common areas on similar terms. Thomas would receive a total of about $6 million, less than the developed land was worth, but far more than what his grandfather had been paid, which was nothing. Crucially, all documents related to the original land acquisition would be turned over to the county prosecutor's office for review. And within 30 days, the HOA board would issue a public apology acknowledging the wrong that had been done. As news of the settlement spread, Thomas received a flood of calls from Oak Ridge homeowners. Most were relieved, grateful for the chance to secure their properties legally. A few were angry, feeling they shouldn't have to pay for land twice. But the majority recognized the fairness in the compromise. David and Lisa Thompson invited Thomas for dinner at their home, his first time actually entering the Oak Ridge community as a welcome guest rather than an adversary. You're something of a local hero now, David told him as they sat on the back deck after dinner, looking out over the golf course. Standing up to Taylor and Barnett like that, Thomas shook his head. I was just trying to right a wrong. Most people wouldn't have fought so hard, Lisa said, or been so reasonable in victory. I kept thinking about what my grandfather would want, Thomas admitted. He wasn't a vengeful man from what I've learned about him. He believed in fairness. As they talked, Thomas found himself drawn to the community in a way he hadn't expected. These were good people who had been caught in someone else's scheme. In the weeks that followed, as he worked with homeowners to complete the land sales, he came to know many of them personally. Rachel, a pediatric nurse who had saved for 15 years to afford her house. Joe, a retired teacher who had moved to Oak Ridge to be closer to his grandchildren. Young couples just starting out, retirees enjoying their golden years. All of them now linked to Thomas through this unusual shared experience. 30 days after the settlement, as required, the HOA board called a community meeting. Every resident of Oak Ridge Estates was in attendance along with local media. Thomas sat in the back, wanting to observe without being the center of attention. Robert Taylor stood at the podium, his face a mask of controlled emotion. The apology he delivered was technically complete but cold, clearly crafted by lawyers to fulfill the legal obligation without admitting criminal wrongdoing. When he finished, William Barnett unexpectedly approached the podium. Taylor looked surprised as his partner took his place at the microphone. "I have something to add," Barnett said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "What we did was wrong. Not just legally, but morally. We took land that didn't belong to us because we thought we could get away with it. We built homes and sold them to you without disclosing the risks. And when challenged, we lied about it." A murmur ran through the crowd. This was not the carefully sanitized statement they had expected. "I can't speak for others," Barnett continued, "but I want to personally apologize to Mr. Wright and to his family, and to all of you who trusted us with your life savings and dreams." The room was silent when he stepped down. As the meeting broke up, Thomas watched Barnett walk directly toward him. "Why did you do that?" Thomas asked when Barnett reached him. The legal apology was enough. Barnett looked tired, older than his years. "Because I have to live with myself," he said simply. "And because my daughter asked me a question I couldn't answer." "What question?" "She asked if I was one of the bad guys in this story." Barnett gave a sad smile. "I realized I was." 2 months later, the land transfers were complete. Every homeowner in Oak Ridge Estates now legally owned the land beneath their home. The HOA had purchased the common areas. Thomas had received fair compensation for his family's property. The county prosecutor had reviewed the documents from the original land acquisition and filed charges against several former county officials for fraud and corruption. Robert Taylor was under investigation for his role, though Barnett had been granted immunity in exchange for his testimony. With the legal battles behind him, Thomas faced a decision about the remaining 1280 acres of his inheritance. He had come to love the land during his time in Georgia, spending weekends exploring its forests, fields, and streams. He had discovered the places where his grandfather had planted trees, built small structures, and maintained trails. One evening, as Thomas walked along the edge of the small lake on the property, he called his boss in Chicago. "I've been thinking about that remote work proposal we discussed," he said. "I'd like to take you up on it." "So you're staying in Georgia?" his boss asked. Thomas looked out across the water, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "Yes," he said. "I'm home." The next day, Thomas met with an architect to discuss plans for a house, not a mansion like those in Oak Ridge Estates, but a comfortable home that would blend with the natural surroundings. As they walked the property, Thomas pointed out a gentle rise overlooking a meadow. "This is where my grandfather used to sit and watch the sunset," he explained. "Louise told me he'd bring a folding chair out here every Sunday evening." The architect nodded appreciatively. "It's a perfect spot." As they continued their tour, Thomas's phone rang. It was Patricia. "I just heard from the county records office," she said without preamble. "They're creating a new historical designation for significant properties in the area. They want to include your land as the Wright family heritage property in recognition of its history of black land ownership since the 1920s. Thomas felt a surge of emotion. My grandfather would have liked that. That evening, as the sun set, Thomas brought a folding chair to his grandfather's favorite spot. He sat quietly, taking in the beauty of the land that had been protected by generations of his family, and was now his responsibility. A text message from David Thompson broke his reverie. "Community meeting voted to rename our neighborhood today. Starting next month, we'll officially be Wright Estates. Hope that's okay with you, neighbor." Thomas smiled. It seemed fitting somehow, not as a mark of ownership, but as an acknowledgement of history and a new beginning built on truth rather than deception. He took a photo of the sunset and sent it to David with a simple response. "More than okay. It's perfect." 1 year later. The morning sun cast long shadows across the meadow as Thomas stood on the porch of his newly completed home. Steam rose from his coffee mug, mingling with the early autumn mist that clung to the fields. In the distance, he could see the rooftops of Wright Estates, now legally and rightfully connected to his family's land. So much had changed in a year. Thomas had fully relocated from Chicago, converting his software engineering job to remote work. His house, a modern timber and glass structure that seemed to grow naturally from the landscape, was finally finished after months of construction. Most importantly, he had put down roots in a community that had once seen him as an enemy, but now embraced him as a neighbor. The sound of tires on gravel pulled his attention to the driveway, where Dorothy's car was approaching. Thomas smiled. The elderly lawyer who had first called him about his inheritance had become a regular visitor, and something of a surrogate grandmother. "Right on time," Thomas called as she got out of her car. "Coffee's hot." Dorothy joined him on the porch, accepting the mug he offered. "Beautiful morning," she observed, looking out across the property. "Your grandfather would have approved of what you've done with the place." Thomas nodded, feeling the familiar mix of pride and regret that came with thoughts of the grandfather he'd barely known. "I hope so. Trust me," Dorothy said, patting his arm. "I knew Harold for 40 years. He'd be proud of all of it. The house, the land preservation, and especially the foundation." The Wright Family Land Trust had been Thomas's response to his unexpected wealth. After receiving the settlement money from the land sales, he had established a non-profit organization dedicated to helping Black families protect their land ownership, particularly in rural Southern communities where heirs' property issues often led to land loss. "Speaking of which," Dorothy continued, "I brought those historical documents you wanted for the opening ceremony." The grand opening of the Trust's headquarters was scheduled for the following weekend. They had renovated one of the old farm buildings on Thomas's property, transforming it into a modern office space while preserving its historical character. "Perfect timing," Thomas said. "Let's take them inside." As they entered the house, Thomas's phone buzzed with a text message from Patricia. "Just got the verdict. Call me when you can." Thomas excused himself to make the call, his heart beating a little faster. The criminal case against Robert Taylor and several former county officials had gone to trial 3 months ago, with Patricia serving as a special counsel to the prosecution. "What's the news?" Thomas asked when Patricia answered. "Guilty on all counts," she replied, her voice tired but satisfied. "Taylor got 5 years. The former county clerk got 3. 2 others took plea deals earlier." Thomas let out a long breath. "And Barnett?" His testimony was crucial. "Without him, we might not have gotten convictions. He's still facing civil penalties, but no criminal charges as agreed." The news brought a complicated mix of emotions. Thomas had never wanted revenge, just accountability. Now finally, that accountability had come. After finishing the call, Thomas rejoined Dorothy, who was arranging old photographs and documents on his dining table. "They were convicted," he told her. "All of them." Dorothy nodded solemnly. "Justice doesn't always come, but when it does, it's sweet." They spent the morning organizing materials for the exhibit that would be displayed at the Trust headquarters, telling the story of the Wright family land and the recent battle to reclaim it. Old black and white photos of Thomas's great-grandfather standing proudly beside newly purchased fields. Faded deeds and tax receipts carefully preserved through decades. Newspaper clippings about the lawsuit and settlement. Around noon, they were interrupted by another visitor. David Thompson pulled up in his SUV, waving through the windshield. "Hope I'm not intruding," he called as he approached the porch. "Thought you might want to see this hot off the press." He handed Thomas a glossy booklet, the new Wright Estates Community Guidebook. On the cover was a photo of the neighborhood entrance with its new sign, and below it a smaller photo of Thomas's great-grandfather. "The historical section we talked about," David explained. "The HOA board approved it unanimously." Thomas flipped through the pages, finding a thoughtfully written history of the land, acknowledging the Wright family's long ownership and the unfortunate circumstances that had led to the development's creation. It wasn't whitewashed or sanitized, it was honest. "This is really good," Thomas said, genuinely moved. David smiled. "It was the least we could do. Actually, that's not why I came by. The community center renovations are finished, and we're having a small gathering tonight to celebrate. We'd love for you to be there." The Wright Estates Community Center had been a point of contention during the lawsuit. Located on what was clearly Wright family land, it had been built without permission and initially used as a symbol of the community's legitimacy. Now it served as a bridge between Thomas and his neighbors, a shared space that acknowledged the past while looking toward the future. That evening, Thomas drove the short distance to Wright Estates. The community had changed visibly in the past year. Gone were the imposing gates that had once made it feel like a fortress. In their place was a more welcoming entrance with a simple sign, "Wright Estates, Eastern 2014, renamed 2024 in honor of the Wright family." The community center was filled with people when Thomas arrived. He recognized many faces now, homeowners he had worked with during the land transfers, people he saw at the local grocery store or coffee shop, neighbors in the truest sense of the word. Lisa Thompson approached with a glass of punch. "The guest of honor arrives," she said with a warm smile. "We saved you a seat up front." "Guest of honor?" Thomas asked, confused. "I thought this was just a renovation celebration." Lisa's eyes twinkled. "Partly. You'll see." The renovation celebration turned out to be something more. After some mingling and refreshments, David called for everyone's attention and invited Thomas to the front of the room. "A year ago, most of us thought Thomas Wright was a threat to our community," David began. "We were wrong. He was the catalyst that helped us become a better, more honest community." He turned to Thomas. "We wanted to thank you properly for your grace and fairness during a time when you had every right to be angry." From behind a curtain, several residents wheeled out a large object covered with a cloth. With a flourish, they pulled the cloth away to reveal a beautifully crafted wooden plaque with brass lettering. "The Harold Wright Community Center, named in honor of a man who protected this land for future generations. Dedicated by a grateful community, 2025. Thomas stared at the plaque, completely caught off guard. He had come to terms with many things over the past year. His unexpected inheritance, the fight for justice, his new life in Georgia. But this simple act of acknowledgement from people who had once opposed him touched something deep. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but full of emotion. "My grandfather spent his life caring for this land because he believed it mattered. Not just as property, but as a legacy. I never got the chance to know him well. But through all of you, through this place, I feel like I've come to understand him." Later that night, as the gathering wound down, Thomas found himself talking with an elderly man he hadn't met before. The man introduced himself as Howard, a retired history professor who had moved to Wright Estates just a few months earlier. "Fascinating story what happened here," Howard said. "Mind if I ask what you plan to do with the rest of your land?" That's a lot of acreage for one person. It was a question Thomas had been considering carefully. "Most of it will stay undeveloped," he explained. "I'm putting about 1,000 acres into a conservation easement to protect it permanently." Howard nodded approvingly. "And the rest?" Thomas smiled. "I'm working with a group of black farmers who need land. Small-scale, sustainable agriculture. I'm leasing parcels to them at affordable rates with options to purchase over time." "Continuing the legacy, then," Howard observed. "In a way," Thomas agreed. "My great-grandfather bought that land when many people said he couldn't or shouldn't. My grandfather protected it when others tried to take it away. I figure the best way to honor them is to help others put down roots, too." The next morning, Thomas rose early and hiked to his favorite spot on the property, a small hill overlooking both his new home and Wright Estates in the distance. He often came here to think, to feel connected to the family he'd never really known but whose legacy now shaped his life. As the sun rose fully above the trees, painting the autumn landscape in gold and crimson, Thomas took out the small box he'd brought with him. Inside was a handful of soil from his grandfather's grave, which he had visited the previous week for the first time. Carefully, he scattered the soil on the hilltop, mixing his grandfather's resting place with the land he had loved. "We did it," Thomas said softly to the morning air. "We got it back. And I promise it's not going anywhere this time." From his pocket, he took the old worn key to his grandfather's property gate, a gate long gone but whose key had been carefully preserved in Harold Wright's personal effects. Thomas pressed it into the soft earth where he had scattered the soil, a symbolic returning. As he walked back toward his home, Thomas passed the newly completed trust headquarters where dozens of families would soon gather to learn how to pray.